welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Molly Maddox. I am the Community Engagement and Network Development Director at NEWaukee. NEWaukee is a community engagement agency, and we host monthly discussions about topics critical to the future of work that lead to deeper engagement. Today, we're going to have a great discussion about employee resource groups, ERGs, with Angela and Jeremy, who are founders of NEWaukee. As you've probably read in the description, our employee resource groups have been a central pillar to most DE&I initiatives and critical to employee engagement from a bottom-up culture perspective. So we're going to explain to you today and answer a few questions on how to equip your employees and how to have a broader understanding of what ERGs are meant to do. So I want to thank everyone again for coming, and feel free to ask any questions or provide any insight that you might have in the chat. If you do want to ask a question on camera, you can feel free to raise your hand in the Zoom tools at the bottom, and you can ask your question that way instead. All right, so let's get started, and we will have our two guests introduce themselves. Why don't you kick us off, Angela?
Wonderful. Thanks, Molly. My name is Angela Damiani. I'm one of the partners here at NEWaukee, and I could not be more excited about approaching this conversation with everyone today. I will tell you that we have been working with companies to found, to retool, to program their employee resource groups for the better part of the last decade. And this is a true engagement Rubik's Cube. I think there is a lot of good and amazing benefits from this type of strategy within a DEI initiative. But when we talk about dealing with people, like anything else really in HR, it can be complex. And so I'm excited to kind of get into this conversation with everyone here today, because I think there are a lot of things that are being done well these days. And I think there are a lot of things you'll find I'm passionately opposed to. And so I just want to thank Molly and Jer for agreeing to have this conversation with us today.
Excellent. Well, I'm Jeremy Fojut. I'm Angela's business partner. I really have, my experience working with ERGs has been around the community building portion of it and the strategy and some of the tactical things that ERGs can do. And when we've helped a lot of companies in Wisconsin and outside of Wisconsin build these from the ground up, or kind of refresh them, or really align how they align opportunities with the company, or actually disalign them and actually make them communities. So I kind of love, how do we create more meaningful connection between ERGs, and that's where kind of my passion lies.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. As we did mention, if you do have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat, and let's get started. So if someone hasn't started an ERG yet, what type of questions should they ask themselves in order to do so?
Do you want me to go first, or you want to take
the first question? Yeah, I'll just offer my opinion, which is really maybe not a non-answer. And that is what problem are you trying to solve for? This is a strategy that's been used in corporate America for the better part of the last 15 years. And I feel like for a lot of companies, there's a lot of kind of peeking over the edge and saying oh, well, that company has one, so we need them too. And I don't know, depending on the industry that you're in, depending on other ways that you engage your employees, that it's like a one size fits all strategy. And I think starting with why do you think you need this is probably the first question that you need to answer before you get into deciding what types you're going to have, what their goals are going to be, et cetera.
To piggyback on that, I agree with Angela's. What are the outcomes that we want to create, and then build from there? I think to Angela's point about replication, every people created YP groups, and now every one in every city, has multiple YP groups that are pretty haphazard, lack of resources, don't have direction, have a lot of churn. And it's because we just created them because someone else did, without the setting an intention of what we want as the outcome to be. And I think that's the same thing we do with a lot of ERGs. So that'd be my first question as well.
Great. So based on what people are trying to solve for and what the outcomes look like, out of your experiences, what are the most important key factors to success for ERGs that are just starting out? Jared, do you want to start?
Yeah.
This is the obvious one: budget. I just, I always kind of come back to the realization, like, I wouldn't have my marketing people work on the engineering side of things, and I wouldn't have my engineers, work on other portions of
Accounting.
the company, like HR, or something like recruiting. So, and the common budgets question is actually pretty good, and we can dive into that too. But it's resourcing people for the outcome you want, right? If you want to build a community of people that get together and socialize, the budgets are different than if you say, I want to create a talent, I want this to be a talent attraction strategy. And so what I would put on a talent attraction strategy ERG is who's on the leadership of that. So I'd be, from the ground up, is what's our outcome? Second is who's going to lead this? Most of the time, what I've seen in ERGs is we have a really organized person that leads them, but a lack of community building skills. So there needs to be some kind of training on both sides of, if someone isn't as organized, some kind of different training for that person, because inherently they become a leader of people. And so if we're not starting there with, like, who do we want to lead this, like more of a super connector, then I think we're starting the wrong place, as opposed to someone who's going to be an administrator of this culture.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Jerry. I think the other thing to think about is, and it goes back to that why question, anytime you aggregate a population of people, and you ask them to put their input in, because most of the time, the way that these are set up is it's a bottom-up strategy. You want it to be the voice of that constituency that sort of designs what this experience is, that ensures that for that pocket of our employee population, they're being engaged just as fully as others. I think there can be some sort of like pitfalls, are that you have this population of people who are now regularly convening, and naturally as human beings, we start to share ideas, to collaborate with one another, to get excited about the potential of what those collaborations could be. But there isn't enough thought work done to ensure that those ideas are going to matriculate up and potentially impact change within the organization. And so the budget question is always a really interesting one, because I think you can have a really effective ERG that isn't highly resourced in terms of a huge monetary budget, if there are systemic structures in place that allow those ideas to go to the right person. So if that ERG is specifically working, like Jer said, on talent attraction, then you need to have someone, your head of TA, sistered to what their ideas are, so that they can implement in their own strategic plans with their own teams, with their own subject matter experts, how policies, practices, protocols are going to be updated to reflect those ideas that come forth. That doesn't necessarily cost any amount of money, and it doesn't have to, it's not the same thing as having an enormous party planning budget, but I do think will cause tremendous amounts of impact when we talk about actual employee engagement, because it's ideas being heard and those coming to life that I think are the things that people really want to see, right? Like, they want to be asked, what do you think is best for the company? And then when they share whatever those, concepts are, that they're not sort of like stuffed in a drawer, or left behind, or worse, brought forth to a subject matter expert or center of excellence within the company, and then, told like, well, that's not really a part of our strategic plan for this year. So thanks for the idea, but we're going to do something entirely different than that. And that's, setting up communication loops. That's in aligning your strategic planning throughout the year so that those voices can be included before the, the SMEs set out their plans for the following year. Those things aren't things that cost money, but they do take strategic alignment.
Yeah, and to go to Rob's question, what's the attitude about online versus in person? I would say, like, if I had to give like 5 reasons why most of these ERGs fail or don't hit their achievement, one is because we think of ERGs as event-based outcomes, and the only success then would be the amount of people that show up to an event, which isn't how you capture culture and change. That can happen over time if the peer-to-peer culture is built. But I think we focus too much on, like, I think every ERG, it's like, what event are we going to do to push forward our mission, which I think, and I can provide some alternatives later, but that would be one of the top things I think that we should rethink how we engage each other from an ERG's perspective, especially when we are in a hybrid kind of world. And I guess you can go on to the next question. I just wanted to add that in there because I saw it in the chat.
No, so what are some tactics then to increase engagement in the ERGs?
And I think one of the things that is sort of always lost on me, and I don't understand why it's such an issue, is, there's this sense that, like, we're going to have, the multicultural group, or we're going to have the women's group, and most of the activities should be just for that sort of minority population. And I do think there's something to be said about the power of affinity and creating a safe place for people to share their lived experience and to be able to potentially unite together to shift the broader culture of the organization. But I don't know why there isn't sort of a standard operating procedure to have these groups create content or programming that the whole organization is invited to go to. Like, it just doesn't make any sense to me when we talk about how this is meant to further, in the name of diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, and then they get sort of like siloed and in a lot of ways, like, kind of like put at the kids' table. Like, the company's going to have these big grand, events, but the stuff that's happening at the ERG level is just for them, separate from the rest of the organization.
Yeah, again, to go back to the top, I think I'll just share some interesting data across a couple different surveys that I think are really important to set the conversation up. I think the ERG conversation has to be better understood by executive leaders of what they're trying to create. I mean, I'll just give you some interesting data. 100% of executive sponsors say ERG leadership encourages participation across the ERGs. But when you actually poll the people that lead the ERGs, they say only 52%. 78% of executive sponsors believe involvement in ERGs support career advancement, but only 40% of ERG leaders agree with that. So there's a huge still, like Ange, 15 years later, disconnect between what we think they are and what is happening on the ground level. And so that needs to kind of be cleared up in a better way. But as far as like engagement tactics, like what are some strategies? I think people have to do a better job of how to build community than just an event and a newsletter. To me, those are communication. The event is an experience, but I think it's more peer-to-peer too. So how do we kind of connect people peer-to-peer in the ERG and across ERGs? I think it's, really tactical thing. I think instead of the event is an ERG work along day, like work alongside each other all day, or sessions where you're just doing your work, you're next to each other, whether that's online or in person. So you you spend time together. And I think that's where you start to learn you start to build that trust, as opposed to the event, which leads so much to chance, right? Like I've been to a couple ERG events where 1,000 people show up to this one spectacular event, but no one really connects because they're listening to the content. And then we leave and it's content we heard over and over again. And we don't actually form the connections we want to make that change. So it's about cultivating that connection between people. And Andrew, you can jump into if you want to. I don't have to like talk.
Yeah, I'll just add on that. And I think the easiest way to do that tactically is to think about all the programming that comes out in the variety of scales. How can members meet one-to-one? How can they meet in small groups? And then how can they meet with larger groups or the broader organization, right? So is there a way in the myriad of activities that are coming up from the ERG for there to be lots of different ways for them to connect across the organization? And I'll just reemphasize, Jer, what you said about executive sponsors. I think the best tactic to increasing engagement with an ERG is having a very present executive sponsor, which I know is hard, right? Like executives have a lot to go on. They have a lot to do. Do they really need to sit through like, the monthly plan meetings for who's going to be, source the next speaker? That can feel arduous and like, I don't need to be involved in this way, or, this is an opportunity for them to grow their leadership, which I do think it is. But being really tied to the weekly, if not daily, conversation that's coming out from that leadership team is a way that executive sponsors can advocate in the rooms that they're included in, that those other individuals are not, for the bigger, like I said, policy switch changes that need to happen, ways in which the goals of the ERG can be baked into the strategic planning of the overall organization. Quite frankly, it's very rare that you see ERG leadership incorporated at that level of strategy within an organization. And so that's the true role of that executive sponsor, is to be the advocate in all of the rooms where they're not included. And that takes commitment. Honestly, it takes hours a month that a lot of people, I think, kind of take for granted, right? And the other thing that I think we talk about, like major benefits of the participating in the ERG. Somebody put in here, do we pay people? I have a lot of conflicting thoughts about that. But one of the true benefits of participating at a leadership level in an ERG is that you have this opportunity to really run your own budget, run your own team, and perhaps maybe for the first time, right? Usually those who are involved at this level of an organization are, less than 5 or 10 years within the organization. And so it is a leadership development experience, and it should be seen as that, at the sort of meta level, outside of the metrics in terms of number of members or number of activities they put forth. The cultivation of that leadership team should be a KPI that's being measured over time. And you can watch over time whether or not those leaders stay with the organization longer, excel in their own careers, become sort of codified into the senior leadership of that organization. But that kind of extra guidance, that professional development, yes, you can deploy training. If you have your own, training, TD department, or, plug for NEWaukee, we'd be happy to train your own leadership teams as well. But ideally that sort of coaching, mentorship naturally comes from that executive sponsor, again, being sistered to the organization. I don't know, Jared, what do you think about paying the leaders of the ERG to see their initiatives through? Some days I feel like, man, that would just make this so much easier. And then other days I feel like, is that a can of worms that potentially could, cause more friction?
I think, so 51% of people that have, went to or participate in some of these surveys report of having an annual budget to run one of these of $5,000 or less. I don't know what kind of change you can do in a company with $5,000. If I said, here's $5,000, go hire the best team you could get, or here's $5,000, go design a product that you want, that will change the company. So again, going back to the goals, is it if we want to accomplish the feeling of belonging or increase talent retention or increase, what is the thing we're trying to do with each of these? Because they all could be different as well. They all have different goals. But if the goal is to make significant change in the company and not just create like a connection type of group, well, then it has to be resourced properly. I don't know if it has to be its own position. It could be. Again, it depends on size of the company and time commitment. But like I said, if you get someone in accounting that's now leading the ERG, trying to attract more software engineers, what like what? Well, I mean, why is that part of the outcome, right? Like you're not you're setting it up to fail. And so the under $5,000 budget, I think, has to be increased. How you disperse the money could be bonus to people on the board or committee. I don't know if it has to be a complete full-time paid position again, but I think to expect any type of change for $5,000 is kind of laughable.
Jared,
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I don't know if I suggest a right amount though. I think it does depend again on the goals, on the organization. One of the things I've tussled with over the years is perhaps there isn't a stipend for, that leadership level, but for sure, for the year or 2 years that someone's in that president or chair or whatever the titles that people use are, you definitely need to have their performance evaluation included, right? Because this takes time. It's going to take time for that senior leadership of the ERG to devote to any of these activities. And inherently, that means it's going to take time away from whatever their day jobs are. And so for the, commitment that's being made, I think their, direct reporting managers need to have clear sightline and buy-in that for this duration of time, they're going to be involved in this. And there needs to be some accountability at that level as well of, how this has contributed to their day-to-day work, right? I don't know. Part of me feels like it would be really nice though if it was compensated, especially to Tiffany's point about, it's marginalized people having to make the case for their own to be seen, acknowledged, included. Like when we get into the race dynamics of this, it is a burden for any of our marginalized populations to constantly have to be shepherding the, white majority in the organizations through their own, racial reckoning, which is oftentimes where these conversations are burdened, right, in the ERG itself. And that is a significant load of work, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, etc.
Yeah, I think that should be compensated. I think, and it depends again, if the ERG isn't about a business outcome, but more, I guess a secondary outcome of building community and connection is talent retention. But you're not saying, hey, you're going to attract this many people, but by bringing people together is going to help the company because we know for a fact the biggest attractor and the reason why people stay is when they build friendships at work. And it's just up and down, been proven. Like if people form friendships, they work better, they're more productive. So that stuff happens kind of organically sometimes, but sometimes ERGs can help that time togetherness that allows for friendship to kind of spawn. So I think, in some cases, if the goal is just to create these kind of friendship groups or create more connection, it can be budget driven. If it's about leading business outcomes, it needs to be compensated.
That makes sense. So my newest thought these days, very selfishly, is that perhaps we don't need ERGs. We just need something like-minded, Jared, to help facilitate friendships. Do you want to tell everyone what we've been working on from that perspective?
I guess I just want everybody to think about this. And I kind of say this sometimes, but if a tree falls in wood, no one hears it. We know that cliche, right? And does it fall? But if you don't interact and engage and connect deeper to your coworkers in today's time, do you really work with them? And I think we're in this new future of work where connection is a huge problem. I mean, we are working with clients right now that are saying that people aren't connecting and are leaving the company because they can't find friends. So my goal is to make more friends inside the workplace. And that we're in this time where we're going to be hybrid. People are going to be remote. Some people are going to be person, and you're not going to interact with people as much. What are we doing as ERG leaders or as people in human resources to actually curate connection? And I guess you'd call it a version of deliberate serendipity. Serendipity still happens, but how do we be more deliberate about connecting our people in the workplace? Which I think was at one of the key cores of why these were created in the first place, right? To bring like-minded people together, and that's what we've kind of been building and testing in companies right now. Is how do we bring people in ERGs not only together in the ERG but across ERGs? Like, how do we de-silo the ERGs and help people connect across them to actually create more of a movement, I guess, inside, more of an actual community that's not closed off.
Absolutely.
I love it.
So with like-minded and other groups that you've implemented these practices with, what are ways besides events and besides newsletters that you are trying to allow people to connect across ERG groups rather than siloing themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned one before. So the question that I hear a lot is, how do I measure what's going on inside of a community? So to take another step back, is community is the future of companies. How we build them internally and externally is how companies, you're already seeing on the coast, you're seeing chief community officers, you're seeing companies really take this seriously. For those of us in the Midwest on the call, we haven't seen a lot of this yet, but it's happening. It's taking over. Is how do we make people feel like they're part of a community when they're in the workplace or outside of it? So how do you measure the health of that? The way I measure it is monthly reoccurring relationships. How many people are meeting each other and how often they're meeting, and how's that relationship being built? And if they're just meeting on their team, are they meeting outside their teams? I was talking to someone at Milwaukee Tool the other day, and he said, what helped me is that the reason I stayed at the company was I met people across the whole company really quickly. But I remember the first year starting, it was, I wanted to leave. And over time, I ended up meeting a bunch of different people and building relationships. It's like, how do you expedite that, right? Like, so that's kind of my goal with working with NEWaukee, is how do we expedite people feeling like they're integrated into the company? So I talked about work alongside each other days. I work every Wednesday out of a co-working space with a bunch of early stage founders, and sometimes we talk, sometimes we bounce ideas off each other, but we just work in the same space. And you can do that online as well. But it's a segment of time where you're spending time with that ERG that just isn't as transactional as like, let's go down this agenda. And so that's a couple things. And you might have some too.
Yeah, my favorite thing I've seen recently is a local young professional or sort of next gen ERG approached HR to look at their total rewards, their benefits package. And they did their own querying, their own surveying of their core demographic, and came back with real suggestions about things that real benefits, when they were doing their annual review of their policy and buying a new one, and had updates made to that. So it was something that obviously, was truly taking their ideas and bringing something into action that allowed that population to feel like, oh, we're being considered even at this sort of like, high level within the organization. And again, has nothing to do with events themselves. It's more about, how are you taking care of me? It's not just that I get, the standardized healthcare plan that is offered. I'm making sure that it's something that's included what my population really like cares about and wants to be known for. The other thing I've seen that's interesting is, historically ERGs have been based on demographics, like race or gender. Sometimes there's like veterans group or differently abled, things like that. Recently, I've seen things like parents or even new parents groups, which I think are kind of interesting. Really looking at kind of life stage and the like major transition that becoming a parent has, not only on your personal life, but quite frankly, like how it affects your professional life too. And I think creating programming for new parents to find one another and to figure out how to navigate reintegrating into the workplace with this new little tiny human at home is a really sort of interesting
to play on that.
newer focus that I've seen.
One of the ones that I think is the most important that I don't see anybody do to my now. I mean, obviously, I think some people have done it, but it is new to the city affinity groups or new to the company affinity groups, like a landing place for people to get integrated in the community they just moved to if they're moving, or people when you change. So one of the reasons why people are lonely and isolated is as life stage change can be daunting. So if you're as you get older, it's harder to make friends. If you, once you're out of college, that life transition is pretty substantial to a first job. But, the big thing is when people move, when they uproot their families, or even if they move alone, they have to create a whole new social fabric of relationships. And that can be a large task. So how do you, if I was creating an ERG, the first one I would create would be a new to the city. And new to the city, new to the company ERG that then can disperse people into other ERGs as they get more acclimated to the company and the community. But it's this life stage moment that Ann said that we kind of just take for granted, or like, people are coming here, they're new, and then we kind of push them into a certain ERG instead of saying, hey, here's how you get integrated. Here's the onboard and integration type of ERG.
Jared, I have a question for you related to that. Living in this sort of like hybrid reality, I know for some companies, they've declared they're not going to come back, maybe forever. What do you feel like, how has that changed your advocacy for company and community connection? I know for years we said, a major part of your retention strategy is embedding people in the broader community, regardless of what ERG you're focused on. There needs to be a tethering to the community to sort of anchor employees here. What do you think about that in light of this, I don't know, weird pandemic world we're living in now?
Yeah, I mean, I still think, well, the new to company ERG is still kind of really important, right? Like, when you start especially if the company's massive, right? Like, you have 1,000 employees, 500 employees, you don't know the politics, you don't know landmines, you don't know, ERGs can help with that. But if you're, if there's someone that like it's their job to go to this ERG once a month or to be part of discussions that are helping you integrate into the company, that can be extremely helpful to, I guess, landing there. But what do I think about, like, where do I think the future of community goes if people are moving to the city? Is that kind of what you're asking, or is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, I just think like, if you could be remote forever and you decide you're going to like move to the mountains and your company is located in a, I guess I'm thinking about it from the framework of like always advocating for the city of Milwaukee, which is like, a tier 2 or tier 3 city. And so I've always been like, this is a great place. Like if we have people love this place and take this place, it'll be a better place for all of us. It'll be this like flywheel of a talent attraction. And I'm questioning that now. Like, does it matter? You could, even for our own team, we have people who work in Barbados and Montana and Denver. Like
more, right?
They're not in Milwaukee anymore.
I think it matters more. I mean, the things that we've kind of implemented at NEWaukee, of bringing people in. I think what you'll see is, you're going to see less travel, but when you do see travel, you'll bring people in for social experience and, connectiveness, if you're doing that. But I think what this is the big question, right? Like, are people going to become more isolated because they don't interact with people at work? I had someone that was graduated from Marquette Business School the other day tell me he never met like any of the people in his class. And then he said to me, did I really even have people I went to school with, right? Like, so it's like, so that feels really lonely, right? Like you don't have that shared experience. I mean, the shared experience is your own experience then. So what I would do if I was a company and I had a new to city ERG, because it operates the same way, is like, if you're moving to wherever you want to, you're new to that city. So how do I help you land in that city? Or how do I help you integrate in your own city? So if it's a new to company, new to city ERG, and you live in Nashville and your corporate office is in Milwaukee, then my job as a company is to make sure you're grounded in your own community. Well, how do I help doing that? You know, how do I help connect you to the organizations I know that we trust that help you build your network, your community, your friendships? If you haven't done that, right? Like not everybody is a master networker, goes out, you know, has those relationships. Some people are introverts, maybe have deeper relationships, but people are still searching. You know, we're the loneliest we've ever been in the world during any human history or any time in human history. That tells me what we have been doing isn't working. So we need to put an emphasis on connection. And, you know, I think that is helpful. Even if you're not coming to a city, it's helpful to help people connect in their own city, because it's about happiness, right? And the ERGs can do
Yeah,
that.
I agree.
So
Yeah, I
let's
agree. And I
say if
think,
you have an ERG that's affinity based, you know, how do I connect to an affinity based group inside a city? Like, how do we make those connections? It's like externalizing your ERG, which most of them are internalized. And so you have to externalize your ERG to each community that you have representation in.
yeah, and in some ways that goes back to budget, right? Budget and bandwidth, right? So a company has now this like, you know, almost like a diaspora of their employees, right? Scattered around the whole world. How are you going to have individual community impacts for a location where everyone is? You're obviously going to have to prioritize where there's areas of concentration. Rob asked this question about online versus in-person versus hybrid events. You know, I think especially for big companies that have chapters of their ERG across multiple locations, there's always been a tension where there's like a density of, you know, more people versus another. And so they tend to be like the stronger groups. The one thing that has been nice, at least about the like one-way communication, so like messages from senior leadership, keynote speakers, workshops, things like that, that they can be ubiquitously experienced now because of this online reality we live in. But I just feel like we're going to default to in person, aren't we? When we can more uniformly. I can't imagine that this will be the way things go forever and ever. Because people want to be together. I mean, isn't that really like kind of the point?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't you know, there's a lot of new research on online communities and people building strong online communities. We haven't done enough research to understand the outcomes of that. Like, do you get the same fulfillment of an online community that you will, you know, in person, is using five senses, or, you know, for whatever, you know, that kind of thing, like getting that connection in person, as we're a social species, we want to connect in person. Can you do that? My assumption is not yet. I don't think technologically we're there yet, to having that kind of five-dimensional experience online as we, you know, chat and stuff like that. But I think from Rob's point of like, how do you build an ERG when people are all over the world? And this has always been the problem with ERGs, and they will always face when they're event focused, because it's all about bringing people together for a moment in time, as opposed to how many people in that ERG can I connect to each other to have deeper relationships than a superficial type of event experience. So if we can connect one-to-one, and, you know, think about how companies start, how culture starts. It's usually one-to-one that gets another one, that gets another one, and it builds and it builds and it builds, because people find like-minded, like equal ground, and start to build things. So the more we can put people together is what we should be doing, especially in hybrid environments, knowing there's time constraints and things like that. So that would be my focus, I guess, for people in the hybrid world, is how do we get more people peer-to-peer or small groups, as opposed to even I don't want to, and maybe I'm limiting or kind of downplaying, the events are important piece of the puzzle. They're not the biggest part of it, I think, in the future, especially when it goes to hybrid. It's definitely going to be communication.
Yeah, and you said something kind of
connection.
interesting to me. A couple weeks ago, you and I were at that conference. And we came out from a breakout session from the main theater, and you said, I think I would prefer to get all my professional development content online. And if we're going to be sitting in a room with 100 people, actually interact with the 100 people that are around me, which I just was like, it was so clarifying for me, like the disconnect I was also having. First time I've been at a conference in 2 years, right? Like how strange it feels now to sit quietly 6 feet apart from other actual human beings in a dark theater and watch content that I feel like, shouldn't we just be doing this at Zoom? I'd rather be interacting with these people I don't know who are right here next to me. That thing I think is going to be kind of interesting as we continue to approach what a hybrid reality looks like.
I mean, there's an unlimited amount of very interesting discussions you can look for online. So is it a shared experience if you're multitasking, not really, being part of it? So yeah, being talked to events. Yeah, it's dialogue fosters connection. It's a good point. And so we're going to ask about, sorry, I'll let the audience talk about the future here of trends and results. I don't know if you want to go into that, but yeah, I mean, my point was, I'm at a conference now. I haven't been in a conference forever. I can listen to this story online now, even though they're really interesting stories, but it was like, there's all these people that I want to tap in and hear from them. And I just felt like I wanted to network more than ever. And usually don't necessarily need to do that.
I have one more question for you, Jer, related to the number of people who are in our ERG, and this goes back to the budgeting and resourcing. One of the KPIs usually is, well, you'll get more money if you have more members, and members is usually just subscribers, right? That people have signed on to a distribution list. What's your take on that? Like, is the number of people in a group a true sign of health of a ERG? Is it okay if you have one that's a dozen people, but they're actively involved?
I mean, sometimes the more people you put in a group, I mean, have you ever heard of the Kohler theory? The more people you get in the group, the less productive people are. Your actual production goes down as the more people you put in a group. And so if you're looking to produce something, as far as more people into a group, it depends on how engaged they are. It's going to be up to that. Every person has to be deeply engaged in an organization to be a part of it, to content, read it, and understand it. So I mean, it really, I guess you have to look at it like this: is that's not an attack on Kohler. It's called the Kohler theory. It's like a Ohio State study. If you want to look it up, it's pretty interesting study. Kohler is very productive. I'll say that. But anyways, to go back to it, it's like, what are you trying to build? Are you trying to build an audience? Are you trying to build a community? So in an audience world where it's one to many, it's important to get many, right? If you're trying to build a community, it's peer-to-peer. So it doesn't matter how many people you have in a community to make it strong. Actually, sometimes a good community starts small, has a good following, and then when people try to enter the community, they're very protective of that community, and they want people to uphold the values of that community. The way we usually operate these in ERGs is about getting as many people into it as possible, which is more of an audience development than a community building thing. I'm not, Rob, I don't know if I should go into the whole Kohler theory, but there's a really good article on it if you want to just Google Ohio State Kohler. But yeah, so I guess my thing is the size isn't as important as what people are getting out of it. And that could be any size, especially in the ERG where you shouldn't be trying to build an audience. You should be trying to take values and make them part of the company culture.
Absolutely. Sheila, to your question about trends from, I would say 2020, 2021, the most interesting thing I've seen is a new emphasis on mental health. So setting up mental health ERGs where we're specifically looking at the collective trauma that we've all experienced by going through a global pandemic. So everybody has had changes to their life, no matter who you are. We've all been, there's nobody that's been like unscathed in some way or another. And I think employers who recognize that in order for you to show up and be your whole healthful self, in order to be a productive and effective employee, your mental health and the state with which you're navigating everything that's happening outside of your kind of 9-to-5 priorities needs to be addressed. That I think is new. I'm hoping that it stays, to be honest with you. I'm hoping it's not just something that we talk about in 2021 and 2022. And as the, knock on wood, the side effects of the pandemic start to subside, that we stop caring about this. I think a lot about during the Great Recession with so many millennials not being able to enter the workforce or being laid off from the workforce. One of the outcomes of that was the sense of, somebody mentioned in the chat, like gig economy, being able to work flexibly. And it really took the pandemic to sort of codify that as like a new way of working. I'm hoping that we see the same sort of thing with this emphasis on mental health. I know that's not something that you would really have ever talked about at work. You know what I mean? Like you would perhaps use the EAP available to you from your benefits plan, but it wasn't a thing that you maybe brought into your workspace or shared with your team members. And I think it's better for all of us if we sort of address that. And I hope that, when we think about the impacts, and Jeremy sort of spouted some of these stats up, we were dealing with a social isolation crisis before the pandemic for a really long time. And my highest hope for the workplace was that, of all of the major institutions that have really diminished in their like potency in the last several decades, the workplace hasn't, right? Like you think about the fact that where people used to congregate to feel connected to a community, whether it be a religious institution or a community rec center or, even trust in institutions like the media and our government, all of that has slowly diminished. But we all still need to go to work every day. And so if our workplaces can be an outlet for us, to feel socially connected, isn't that just like the highest and best use? I mean, because then employers have really, productive employees, and employees are more healthful, whole individuals contributing to society.
Yeah, I think the future of employee resource groups, we've talked about a couple of them, but I'll just repeat them. Is going to be community. It's going to answer mental health is going to be huge, and then I think one of the more underlying things, and especially when we see like, it's retention. As people are leaving companies in droves, people aren't entering back into the workforce. They're looking for, what their fulfillment and work. I think ERGs have a really good opportunity to be the think tank for the future of work in that company. And if we want to have a think tank and we want to have a group working on solving the problems of the future of work inside the company, I think the ERGs are the best place to do it because they're people on the ground, they're people in different verticals, they're people in different stages of their career, and it would be a good way to understand how people are working. And then I think the ERG has a lot to play in that, like how people work, how people interact. But I mean, as I can see right now, if ERGs are going to have to, as little resources they are going to be the front line of how are we going to connect to each other in the future. Because we have 100 different tools to connect to each other in the workplace, but we're more isolated in the workplace than we ever have been. So it tells me these tools aren't getting at the fundamental thing of what we want, which is human connection. They're allowing more productivity, but they're not connecting us to where we can leave the company in the first 3 months because we don't have that feeling that we belong there. So I think that's where the future of them will go, is how do we solve that problem?
Do you feel like the goal of ERGs is to then connect with one another, with the outside community, and additionally with the entire company and organization?
Yeah, if the business case is to extrapolate the culture and export it so to get people to work there, I think that I've seen very, very few and far between of like, I hear people say we're a great place. When you talk to people, we're a great place to work. We're a great place. This is the best. Our number we won this award. We won this award. We won this award. But we don't. How do I? When people explain culture, it's so amorphous. So it's hard to. So the only way to actually showcase it, and that's where I think the events could go for an ERG, is the events are externalized to get people to understand the culture. There's a company here doing like 1,000-person online event in a couple weeks around women in technology, but it's hosted by the company. So the company is showcasing some of their culture, some of their people, and it's put on by, or is instigated by an ERG within the company. So that externalizing of the company culture, I think, is the authenticity that people need to attract. The awards, winning an award for best place to work doesn't tell me anything really about the company and the culture and do I fit in there, do I belong there. It just tells me someone wrote about you. And so I think if we can use the ERG to, we're a great place to work, except when I have to do this. I got you. Okay. And so I think the focus should be on externalizing stuff for a talent attraction thing, but then again, it should be tied to a budget so we can host that type of thing to get there.
And do you have any
Other questions from the audience? Oh, sorry.
No,
I was just gonna say, are there other questions from the audience? These have been fun to see. Thank you guys for peppering us with these as we go through. Sorry, Mo.
no, that's fine. If not, I was going to ask if you wanted to give any more specific examples that you've seen the ERGs work effectively especially throughout this past year, or anything that we're working on for the year ahead.
I think the things that have been most curious to me have been the companies we've been working with that have been leveraging like-minded as a way to have people connect over their personal interests, which is a little bit adjacent to the ERG, right? Like it's like, oh, we're both interested in hiking, and we're like allowing there to be that common interest in a place for us to just be friends, which in some ways feels a little lighter. Because if I'll be totally honest, like the structure that's needed for an effective ERG and dealing with the transition of that leadership, because ideally it's something that people sort of come in and out of, all of that takes a lot to uphold. And there's sort of this breath of fresh air that I'm feeling with the way that like-minded can help employees just find one another who have a common interest. And then they can go like plan their own hiking excursion, and it doesn't require company resources. It doesn't require, I think what you're describing with the Women in Tech event is amazing. It's amazing that it came through the, female ERG, but then it requires like their external PR team and their external events team. You know what I mean? It requires like this massive infrastructure around it. And I think about some smaller companies we've worked with that don't have that type of framework or that type of resourcing. And, creating a platform for people to just find others who have common interests is just as simple as it has to be, right? It just doesn't have to be more complicated than that.
The question we have here is, how do you
something?
suggest addressing mental health in the workplace? Just a sensitive topic. And I'll just, again, I'll go back to the same thing I keep harping on, is peer-to-peer support and friendship. So people will talk about deeper things when they have people they trust. And if we don't build mechanisms to create more trust in the workplace, then it's hard to have those kind of conversations. So what are you doing to connect your people to people and build and form those relationships? And if it's, what we saw in the past was, we hosted a company picnic, went to a Brewer game, those sort of things are nice and fun, but they don't get down to what people really want. And that's deeper, meaningful connection. And so if you're not facilitating that in an ERG or in the workplace in general, it's hard to have a deeper conversation like mental health. So you get it more distributed down as a talking point than you get a real conversation. From the mental health subject becomes top down and becomes, in the company intranet, it becomes like a campaign to talk about it, but who are you going to have that conversation with if you don't trust anybody?
Tell me
Absolutely.
a story about an absolutely catastrophic failure. I don't know if we had.
Oh,
I mean, I think,
are you speaking ERG, Kayla, or is that just
It can
yeah,
be
just in
we
general,
have
honestly,
lots
all
of
of our
other events
failures?
that failed.
it can
Yeah.
totally be any virtual engagement. I just know that we've all had one at some point, and you guys do so much engagement with NEWaukee. I just thought it'd be really interesting. I know I've had my fair share as well this past year or two.
Yeah, I think,
Oh,
most of
Kayla,
our
I'm going to call
failures
on
have
you
been in
first, then. You
person.
tell us.
Aside from technical issues, of course, just like dropping out completely when you're in the middle of hosting the meeting. I think one thing I found is we're having like guest speakers join us too. So we're bringing people in from outside of Kohler, and there's a lot of, details in getting that all set up. And I'm working in our sustainability space, so we have some proprietary information that we don't otherwise share. So getting your ducks in a row to make sure that you have all of that legal documentation done ahead of time is always great advice for anyone. That's definitely been one of my interesting situations that has arisen. But I think also this has really been helpful. And actually, Kaylee Peterson's on the call from Kohler as well, and her and I are meeting right after this about some stuff. But one thing I've found that seems to be amiss right now, honestly, in our community is that sense of community, like Jeremy was talking about earlier, just giving people that time to connect versus just sitting there and listening or watching other people connect instead. And so I think moving into the next year, it's going to be a great opportunity to kind of build more of that.
Yeah, I think
That, and one of the simplest things I've heard of that recently is, and this can be hard if you have a very heavy meeting culture, right? Where like most of your work is bopping from meeting to meeting. But if you are a contributor whose job it is to, produce things, like simply opening up a Zoom or a Teams where you just have it in the background. So you're just with your coworkers and everybody's doing your work, right? And you can have a chance to like, have the little side conversations that you don't normally get to have when you like have a 25-minute scheduled, I have to get in and out. That sort of thing I think can be really helpful. I think the biggest failure I've seen with virtual engagement is not pivoting with the content. You know what I mean? I think like, especially early on, in the spring of 2020, we tried just about everything you could possibly try in this virtual format to really figure out like, all right, how do you make this an actual space that people feel like they can interact with? And we learned a lot of things, and we also learned a lot of things not to do. And I just think, being nimble enough and graceful enough with yourself to say, all right, we tried it and it didn't work, rather than, you know what I mean? Like, oh, we only had 5 people come this month. Well, I guess we should like line up the same kind of boring panel discussion for next month. Like, just be okay with letting things go. And I also think being okay with, and I know everyone is really hating that like new normal, like, statement or whatever. It's like becoming very cliche, but like that it might not go back to whatever it was. And that's okay too. Rather than sort of like force a square peg into a round hole over and over.
I mean, as far as the biggest failure, at the beginning of the pandemic, we did a ton of them. It was, continuing it, not cutting it. I think is the failure of it. Like but I would say the underlying failure is is not thinking of every interaction as a two-way conversation. If you're building, depending on what you're building, like if you're like right now, we're building a content-driven event to talk about insights. But if I was building this internally, I wouldn't do this talk for my company internally, right? I think many organizations are kind of missing the community opportunity because it's a short-sighted focus on transactional value, like in the context of like a specific use case. Like, companies that are like growth-minded are fully embracing that community as a concept, and they're integrating community building practices kind of into that fabric of the business. And that is really, really hard to do. So when we get to online events, the online event portion and the reason they fail is because there is no community around it, and there's no interest maybe in the topic, but somebody spoke up and we took that person's opinion as the only opinion. So when you're in a community, you can understand what everybody wants. When you're building it from whoever talks the loudest, you end up with an event where you have a topic where no one wants to listen to it except maybe the person that said it. So it's understanding who's in the room too.
I have a kind of random question for you, Jer. And maybe it's only been happening to me. I haven't actually said this out loud before. What do you think of the like private DMs that are available on all of these different virtual platforms? I have come to find that like being able to be in a room with my favorite colleagues and be able to like side chat to them while a program is happening has made the program more engaging for me, in a way that like if we were at an event, I probably would feel like a jerk having my phone up texting, but for some reason, like, there's like a bit of anonymity here. Do you think that that's a measure of engagement or disengagement?
I think it's a measure of engagement. I think it's a measure of engagement. I love it. I absolutely think it's the best thing to get into. I was on a conference the other day that was like a national conference, and I saw someone I haven't talked to in like a year, and they were in the same room and we were DMing each other about the content. Now, this is, this is the exact example of what a community is. It's a reoccurring relationship, me talking to somebody else about what's happening and a shared experience that is private, but is engaging because it's like we're getting off topic here a little bit, but it all comes back to engagement. It's like a micro interaction that has kind of went to the wayside, right? As we're not seeing each other in person, we're not seeing that person we wave to in the office or wave to when we walk to get coffee. Those micro interactions actually lead to a lot of happiness. And because those have been taken away, you have to create new kind of micro interactions. And the DM, the private DM to each other is one of those micro interactions. It's kind of like the wave in the coffee shop or the stop, by the water cooler type of thing that I think is really important. I'm sure some people are DMing right now, and that's like saying, Jeremy, stop rambling. But I think
yeah, I would say to bring it back to the ERG. I think nobody needs like another email in their inbox. So finding a way for the members to communicate with one another, whether it's through like an internal social platform like a Yammer or Slack, but that I think is really a critical part of it. So it's not just the organizers, again, sort of shouting out that we're going to all do this next activity, but it's for the members to be able to interact with one another. That piece of it, I feel like, gets taken for granted, and especially in this hybrid reality where we don't have all the extra time and exposure to one another, investing in that is going to be super important for the health of your ERG.
Are we over time?
Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, I'm nearly out of time. I think a lot of people have been providing recordings. Jill, I have a question for this audience. Does anybody watch them? Every single time we do a webinar, somebody in the chat asks for it, and I feel like we cut it down, we throw it on YouTube, and I feel like who has time to watch other people's webinars?
Well, I mean, yeah.
But I think being careful about, how that editing happens can be really helpful. Although I think expressing or having forums for real vulnerability get into some of those harder topics, right? Especially around mental health, like especially as leaders, finding a way to be vulnerable with your teams can create a culture of vulnerability that allows people to feel like they have psychological safety, they can trust one another, they can bring forth when they're having a personal problem that might affect their professional lives.
I'll just, Kayla kind of brings up an interesting topic. This is again, and I don't want to keep harping on events, but I just want to drive this through. It's about connection and community. It's the event can be that mechanism, but the challenge with events is always going to be it's a moment in time that not everybody can make, or not everybody wants to make because they don't feel comfortable in that situation. So the more and more we focus on event as the output of the ERG culture, the less and less community we probably are building between our members. Because if you think about an event, there's a chance that that person might not show up to it because they have other obligations. And if they do show up to it, do they connect with anybody? Maybe they don't. If they do connect, is it superficial and not deep? Like someone said, my chat went down the screen now, so I can't see the comment, but do they have a very vulnerable or deeper conversation that leads to another conversation, a reoccurring relationship? And so that can be driven by events sometimes, but there has to be a new way to think about that if we're talking about a hybrid in a remote world.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. If
not leaving everything to chance, I guess is, sorry, Molly, I interrupted.
No, you're fine. What it sounds to me is that the future of ERGs is perhaps a little less grouping of the employee resource groups and more just finding different ways to connect with one another individually and with like-minded people.
Well, I think too, Molly, like we've learned a lot now. Like, they've been around for a while. We've some people have started them because other people have started them with not knowing why they're starting them. And so now it's time to refine them and figure out what's the best path forward. So ERGs will start to form around conversations that are important to the employees. So mental health being one of them. We're in a time of extreme isolation, so connection is going to be important, that kind of thing. So I think that's where these conversations were headed. So the future.
Definitely.
Well, thank you, Molly, for hosting us for this conversation. Jerry, I know you and I could nerd out about this all day. I appreciate all of the active chat this morning.
Yes, thanks so much for chatting with us, and thank you everybody else for all of your questions.
Sorry, someone knows when it's over.
Oh my goodness. So the next chat will be on October 26th, where we will talk about the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion in corporate America. We hope that you'll join us for that.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
Have a wonderful day.
So much.